So I'd just like to start with the idea around gut health and why am I talking about it today, and where does it come from, and what is, it's been a bit of a buzz term for many, many years. And you can trace it back as far as Hippocrates, where it was said that all disease begins in the colon. And there was sort of primitive use of colonic irrigation even in his time, and that's obviously continued till with current use of colonics, which obviously have some colonics these days have a more automatic function rather than being done manually. You can get these machines to do it, but I much prefer the manual method. I'm happy to talk about that if people want me to. So that's interesting with the history, and I think that if you look at the microbiome of an individual, especially a mother, and then passing on that diversity or lack of diversity to a child, a lot of early life bacterial diversity occurs through the birth canal. And obviously the microbiome of the mother will make a difference to the early life immunity and microbiome of the child. And what we know now through various studies and the information we have is that the gut environment really makes up a massive part of our immune system, and up to say 75% of our immune system is within that gut environment. And some of the early life influences to that environment will be things like, was the child, say, delivered vaginally? Was a child breastfed? Now, it doesn't mean that if a child is born, say, C-section or not breastfed or bottle fed, that they're at a huge disadvantage. And there is a sort of a counter argument for that, which I'll touch on. But because what people are doing now is with vaginal deliveries is even rubbing some of the cesarean delivery, rubbing some of the vaginal secretions on the baby once the baby is born to improve microbiome and microbial diversity. And again, when we look at the sort of the breast milk, bottle milk sort of debate, there is sort of a counter argument in some respects, insofar as although the old notion of mummy's milk is best, what we now know is because of the toxic sort of soup that we live in, that breast milk has a huge array of toxins in, but overall on balance, breast milk is better. But I do believe that we need to be mindful of the sort of shaming that can go on to mums that say, oh, don't have the delivery and don't able to feed their child in the way that they might have wanted to. So that's something I think we need to be mindful of in society. And I think many mums are doing the best they can possibly do, given their circumstances. And often when people want to have a home birth and a vaginal delivery and what have you, sometimes best laid plans don't necessarily work out as one might expect. So I thought I would just touch on the early life aspect of gut health. And I also would like to mention as well that what separates us from health and disease ultimately is the soil, because the soil is full of microorganisms. And if we destroy, which we have been doing, the soil and soil environment, then ultimately that's what ultimately separates us from starvation. Because if there's no minerals, if the soil has no minerals and it's completely dead soil worldwide, we wouldn't survive. And our own microbial diversity is very much dependent in terms of that synchronous diversity with the environment. We're not separate from it, we're part of it. And the way we treat the earth, and in the last 75 years, as we know, has really been at our own cost. And we're ultimately custodians for the future generations, and our future generations have been prejudiced by our own habits. And that in turn affects the Earth's immunity, let's call it, and our own. So going back to the idea of the immune system, what we tend to find is what we've had this whole sort of what we call it, the whole hygiene thing has been very problematic for us in the last few decades, where we've had this much more sterile environment, creating more and more sterile environment. And ultimately what we need to be doing is effectively just playing in dirt, getting dirty, getting our kids messy. And if you look at agricultural and farming communities, they have a much lower incidence of allergy, autoimmune disease, partly because of the microbial diversity that people in those communities are exposed to. And if you look at a lot of Africa, and although they'll have conditions and diseases that are more prevalent that we may not have, there is a much lower incidence of autoimmune conditions and allergy in those environments. Certainly more in the Western cultures, things like hay fever, asthma, eczema are pretty common. And those are ultimately gut-mediated, immune-mediated inflammatory conditions. And because of so much of the gut environment housing our immune system, if we focus on that area and support that area, then what we often find is that those early life inflammatory conditions that people can be prone to, and obviously that go into adulthood, like eczema and asthma, can be completely eliminated. What we also find is that obviously we now have a myriad of conditions that we never even had sort of 75 years ago, especially like stuff along the autism and the and obviously neurodiversity is a sort of a broader term, but certainly things like autism and ADHD and ADD having a massive increase. And I think that a part of that, if you look at the work from Stephanie Seneff, who is an MIT research scientist, she has quite stark predictions in terms of the incidence of autism. And her work, she's probably the leading authority in the world on glyphosate, which, as many of you might know, is obviously what goes into Roundup and has a very deleterious effect on the microbiome. It's very common in genetically modified crops. And she's saying that because of this, we're having a huge incidence alongside adjuvants within vaccines has had a massive impact on the incidence of autism, ADHD, and other conditions such as that. And I think that now that you have, say, if you have a gardener, let's say, and they're still using Roundup in your garden, I would help try and educate them. I mean, Roundup now has been banned in multiple European countries, classed as a class 3 carcinogen, and has a very big deleterious effect on the microbiome. So that's just giving you a bit of a broad picture. Question is, what can we do to encourage a better gut environment, which then improves our health systemically, given that so much of the gut environment is linked to, say, systemic wellness, right? So I think it can partly start with diversity, which I think there's been a buzz term for quite a while now. And people say, well, eat a broad diet, play the rainbow game, which could be something such as go 1 week and eat a load of fruit and vegetables. The following week, you then eat a completely set of different fruit and vegetables you ate the previous week, and you do it for, say, 3 or 4 weeks. And the idea is that by having diversity in the diet of different fruits and vegetables, and also the substances and substrates they contain, such as polyphenols, which are plant-based powerhouses that really work well for the gut environment. The idea is that you encourage diversity within the gut. I'd like to sort of caveat that with, that's all well and good, and it's a great idea, and it's really good eating lots of veggies. And yes, if you can eat 10 portions of vegetables a day, that's brilliant, right? But many people struggle with vegetable-based products and salad and what have you. You know, from an Ayurvedic perspective in digestion, you have this digestive fire called Agni. And in an Ayurvedic perspective, which is the oldest system of medicine that there is, about 5,000 years old, we're told not to eat cooling foods for the digestion, things like salads, or very fashionable things like green smoothies, which have been very fashionable for years. People say, oh, have a green smoothie, it's very healthy. But the problem with green smoothies are they're very cooling on the digestion, and again, may not be well absorbed at all. I think you can temper green smoothies with, say, a lot of ginger, a lot of turmeric, and a lot of spice, and not having them cold. You know, have them sort of room temperature if you can, because the body has to warm up whatever you put into it anyway, to the temperature that it desires. And eating very cold foods is not very good for digestion at all. So I think that, you know, we're not ruminants, and ruminants obviously have multiple stomachs and can digest plant matter a lot better than humans. You know, we've evolved to be omnivorous, and eating a lot of plant matter, not everyone does very well on that. So whilst it might well be great to consume a lot of plant matter, some people it really doesn't suit, and you've got to have really robust digestion to eat a lot of plant matter. And the problem is, we live in a very quite a stressful world. We have very busy lives, and we've ultimately, many of us, become human doings rather than human beings. And as a result, that creates a lot of stress. We now know that the gut and the brain is linked via what's known as the gut-brain axis. So the brain is like the gut is the second brain. We often hear this term as well. And it works bidirectionally. So your thoughts will influence your gut environment, and your gut environment will influence your thoughts. And it's very rare that I've ever seen a patient, well, hardly ever, with IBS or digestion problems or anything of that nature, that doesn't have a nervous system component. You know, it's like that saying, like, well, you know, what's your gut feeling? And we need to trust our gut. And I think many of us don't trust it as much as we should. I'm a victim of that as well, right? But again, the idea is obviously to try and eat food when you're relaxed, because you want to be in that sort of, people will have heard the term, you know, fight or flight, which is when you're in sort of running from that sort of proverbial lion. But there's also another phase, which is rest and digest. So if you're anxious or stressed out, you've had a hard day at work, or you've had a row with someone, or you're stressed out because of something with your kids, or whatever it might be, you're not going to be in that rest and digest phase. And if you decide then to walk up the street eating a baguette, which you do see people sort of quite, it always makes me smile when people are walking up the road and munching a sandwich or something as they're walking along, because ultimately we're not really designed to eat food as we're walking along. We really should be sitting down and ultimately, traditionally and ancestrally, eating around the hearth, with, you know, with time and being in a relaxed state. And many people obviously at work will eat their lunch at their desk, let's say, rather than allowing proper time to eat it. And I think also chewing food as well, you know, is really important. The stomach obviously doesn't have teeth in it, and digestion takes place even before you put the food in your mouth, because your body knows you're going to eat something. You know, that sort of sensation when, like, you see it more in animals, when animals lick their lips, or you get that anticipatory response to eating something. That's because your body's actually even producing salivary amylase to digest your food before you even actually put the food in your mouth. And so taking time is really important with that, and eating mindfully. There's even like a very simple mindfulness practice, I think, which is using a cube of chocolate, where you can let it sit in your mouth and experience the flavor of it with one cube, and actually see what it tastes like, and go through the textures and tastes. And that can be a useful mindfulness practice to sort of getting you used to eating slowly, let's say. But ultimately, chewing food a number of times is helpful, because if we shovel everything in, it puts more pressure on the digestive system. Also, stress reduces hydrochloric acid within the stomach, And as a result of that, we can find it harder to digest fat and protein-based meals. We can take additional supplemental hydrochloric acid via supplements, or you can even use simple things to encourage it, like apple cider vinegar or lemon juice. And again, also you can use bitters. The clinic makes a really good bitters formula, which is available online in various places like Amrita. And that can be very, very useful, because the bitter taste in our diet tends to be quite lacking these days, and is quite needed. Obviously, we can get it in things like mustard greens and radicho and things like that, and rocket. And it is a good way of stimulating digestion. And I do think a lot of the modern conditions of the gut, for me, are sort of like, say, SIBO, for example, is a bit of a red herring. I really think that ultimately SIBO is just a modern name for disordered digestion. If people were digesting better, they wouldn't get reactions to certain foods and then experience things such as bloating, or burping, or constipation, which are the common, some of the more common symptoms with SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. We've also found that, now obviously there's quite a lot of ways of getting probiotics into our diet, whether that's through natural probiotics such as sauerkraut, so fermented foods, so water kefir, dairy-based kefirs, kombucha, and other fermented foods. The problem with, I think, with fermented foods for some people do get a histamine reaction with fermented foods. And again, histamine reactions do tend to often stem from the gut. If we're working on the gut environment and improving that, then those reactions should slow down or dissipate or disappear. Another thing with fermented foods or kefir and things like that is that some of the companies out there make claims as to how many billions of organisms are in their product or their drink or what have you. The problem with that is, yes, they can measure the billions of organisms, but the question then is, does it reach the gut environment? And we have no way of knowing. So I guess we're doing it on faith a lot of the time. However, the company that makes a goat kefir called Chuckling Goat is really good, very powerful kefir. And I have had numbers of patients over the years who really help their digestive symptoms by using the Chuckling Goat kefir. And I've had very good feedback from other practitioners as well with that. That does seem to work really nicely. And I do hear, obviously, people talking about regularly about how natural probiotics have helped them. Also, probiotics can also be used in a supplemental form. And there's so many probiotics out there now, both in liquid form and capsule form. Different probiotics, different species and different strains have different affinity with different conditions and helping with different conditions in the body. And obviously, we haven't got the time today to go through, different strains for different conditions, but there are a huge array out there. And a lot of companies now are branding their probiotics around particular things, whether it's for the skin or for the hair or what have you. And some have, better research than others. What I would like to mention again more around bugs is that sometimes, people can pick up bugs. So it could be what we commonly see in clinic, I suppose, is it can be a bacterial infection in the gut environment, whether that's in the small intestine or the large intestine. And sometimes it's going to be picked up via stool test. Obviously, a famous bug that people will be aware of would be H. pylori, Helicobacter pylori. And the old approach with Helicobacter used to be that it was problematic. It was a bacteria that was unwanted. And you would go to your GP and you would receive what's known as triple therapy. You'd get 3 antibiotics to try and get rid of it. And often it would come back. Antibiotics are deleterious to the microbiome. You can't really regain the microbiome diversity lost through a single course of antibiotics. And obviously we're poisoning also ourselves via more antibiotic resistance is not only coming from doctor prescriptions, but it's also coming from antibiotics used in the farming industry, and probably more so there. So, and what we now know from the research from, say, people like Malcolm Blazer, who wrote Missing Microbes, and the guy who wrote Moses Velasquez, who wrote Epidemic of Absence, we now know that H. pylori may not be the problem that we thought it was. And it may well be a commensal bug that's actually meant to be within the gut environment, is actually meant to be there, and it's meant to be helping us. So unless patients have got absolutely overt symptoms of H. pylori, or they've got a stomach ulcer or something like that, I won't be very aggressive in my treatment with it. And again, I would be trying to improve the gut environment and treat it naturally, than opposed to using aggressive therapy, such as 3 types of antibiotics. Because another problem with using antibiotic therapy for bugs is that, and I've seen this hundreds of times, is that we take antibiotics and then we end up with another infection as a result of the one we just had. So we might have eradicated, say, H. pylori, but then we end up with chronic urinary tract infections as a result of reduced microbiome diversity. So other bugs that people tend to complain of, obviously, things like, things like parasites. And the problem with parasites is that they don't show up so well on stool tests. And they can be in the brain, they can be in the blood, and stool tests sometimes will show them, but sometimes they don't. And so I tend to quite like, if the stool tests are negative, I tend to quite like treating patients empirically, using antiparasitics where I believe there's a problem. And what we sometimes see, if we're lucky, is patients will pass them worms and what have you. Sometimes you don't see that. Doesn't mean they're not improving. But if their symptoms improve, we know we're on the right track. I would say in 50% of cases where I believe there's parasites with a patient, they will improve with herbal treatment. But in around another sort of 50, maybe 40 to 50% of cases, it will need a combined approach of pharmaceuticals with herbs. And those pharmaceuticals will be things like antiparasitics, such as praziquantel and albendazole, because herbs alone sometimes, you know, in maybe a third or what have you, don't work fully. So that's something to be mindful of. And again, within autistic children and children that have in learning difficulties, parasites can be an issue as well, even if the stool tests are negative. So that's something to be mindful. I think doing a parasite cleanse is not a bad idea in many conditions. What I should also talk about with the gut environment as well, because I know we're running short of time now, is intestinal permeability and leaky gut. So one of the reasons why people get health conditions such as autoimmunity and inflammation-driven conditions is that what happens is we get breakdowns like within the cell wall of the gut lining, and particles can get into the systemic circulation within the bloodstream and not retained within the gut environments where we want them, right? And by that happening, we then get inflammatory reactions with the body. The body then can't recognize friend from foe, and we then have a case of mistaken identity, which is effectively autoimmunity. And then we get autoimmunity, and we end up with conditions with fancy names, you know, such as Hashimoto's or rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis and things like that. But ultimately, a lot of that can stem from systemic immunity within the gut environment. And to support the gut environment, we can do elimination diets, we can use prebiotics, we can use probiotics, we can use, like I mentioned, antimicrobials to get rid of unwanted bacteria within the gut environment. We can reduce our exposure to toxins, to glyphosate. We can also use things to heal the gut lining, meditation, mindfulness practice, reducing our stress exposure. We can also do things like using mucilaginous herbs, such as slippery elm bark, which is really, really healing and calming for the gut environment, can be mixed in water between meals 2 to 3 times a day, so a teaspoon. And then there's a whole heap of sort of nutrients that can nourish the gut environment and the gut-brain axis, things from, say, like glutamine and zinc carnosine, the medicinal mushrooms, such as lion's mane, also polyphenols, and again, I say mucolicious herbs like marshmallow root, slippery elm bark. And now we also have some other useful nutrients like serum-derived bovine immunoglobulins, which you can get now in a powdered form, can work quite well for some patients. So one needs quite a holistic approach to dealing with autoimmunity and immune-mediated conditions. But I think that, like I said earlier, I would always use a combined approach with stress reduction practice and mindfulness as part of the practice, because if I'm not doing that with patients with improving gut immunity, then really missing a trick. I'm just going to turn to some of the questions that we've received so far. Someone's mentioned, is it worth doing a regular parasite cleanse without having proof they're there? I think I've answered that insofar as we don't often have proof that they're there. Sometimes you can map your parasite's activity is biggest at full and new moon. So if you find your symptoms are worse around full and new moons, then that can be a clue sometimes that you've got parasitic involvement. Also, someone said, yeah, Mary said, how to increase health of the gut if belly doesn't tolerate fiber well. Well, I think I answered that earlier on, that some people don't actually do well with plant-based foods. So I would experiment with your diet and actually see that if you don't tolerate certain plant-based fibers well, then try using, say, more meat or animal-based products you might find better with the diet. Again, there's a lot of probiotics and a lot of products out there that can help the gut environment. People can use butyrate, which is in butter, but you can get butyric acid supplements now. There is a really nice supplement I quite like from Body Bio. I think it's called Gut Plus. It's got a couple of types of, it's got like a probiotic and a prebiotic in it as well, plus butyric acid. The parasite cleanses someone's asking about as well from Helen. It really depends on the patient, but I tend to start quite aggressively with herbs. So I make a bespoke blend up. I'm a herbalist, so I make bespoke blends for patients, which would include any number of things like usnea and black walnut, dark barberry, podarco, uberossi, and things like that. And then I'll combine that with a couple of Ayurvedic herbs called, one called neem and one called vidanga, and then see how the patient fares with that. And then if there's no noticeable results, then moving more in with pharmaceuticals after that. So with regards to colonics and enemas, obviously some people suffer with constipation. Simple approaches to that can be doing parasite cleansing, but also supplementing with powdered vitamin C and magnesium citrate as a very, very gentle laxative to get the bowels moving. Really, we should be going once or twice a day to the loo. Some patients go once a week, and that's obviously not ideal. Home-based enemas can be used by patients, and you can get really good enema kits from Amazon. And they can be warm water enemas, but there's all sorts of things you can put into enemas, from herbs to garlic. Some people might be aware of coffee enemas, which were sort of popularized by Gerson therapy, which was the cancer treatment. The coffee enemas are very good for detoxification, and yeah, and often cited in patient surveys in the top 5 of one of the things that help get them well from complex chronic illness. So you always see coffee enemas in the top 5 and sort of patient surveys in terms of wellness. And then obviously you can go for a high colonic, because obviously enemas don't get to the ascending colon. So you can go to a high colonic, and I tend to recommend a lady in, still in Belsize Park, called Marika Vogel, who's a very old school practitioner of colonic hydrotherapy. And she's got a website, I think, called phenomenalcolonics.com. So yeah, and then there are obviously other people doing colonics, but she's someone I've known for many, many years. So yeah, I don't find laxatives. I don't use laxatives for patients very often. I mean, there are herbal laxatives that I will use sometimes via a bowel cleanse, and I'll be using things like cascara little bit of senna, turkey rhubarb, cayenne, and things like that combined in capsules. But any sort of form of like bowel cleansing like that, I would only do for a couple of weeks, no more than that, because we want to find, we want to get the bowels moving and keep them regular. And then obviously using sort of things like charcoal and slippery elm and clay, apple pectin, alongside that or afterwards, which can then act as a bit of an intestinal broom, sweeping the toxins and getting them away from the colonic walls and out through the bowels. So then that would be a sort of a very gentle bowel cleanse I might do with some patients. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining today. The recording will be available. And looking forward to seeing people next week for the next one in the series. Thanks again.